so happy we alive.
Good evening, and welcome to Louisville Late Night. This evening we're in beautiful San Francisco, California. And
early in the 18th century, again Malaya. When weary of their own life or illness, they seek death through the punishment and death of others. For this they swallow a lump of opium, which strengthens dedication, disturbs reason, and liberates spirit from restraint. With dagger in hand, they rush like raging tigers into the streets, bent on slaughtering whomever they meet, whether friend or foe, until they themselves are struck down by another person. This is a frequent sight in Java and the further Orient, called hamuk. The very sound of the word terrifies. Well, I found 10 people for about a century into the early 1800s who recount running amok on opium. The most popular repetition of the story by far involves two different stories combined. This will be my last quote on amok, I think, maybe. One of them is the Javanese, under an extraordinary dose of opium, become frantic as well as desperate, and not only stab the objects of their hate, but also sally forth to attack in like manner every person they meet, till it is necessary to destroy them. They shout as they run, amok, amok, which means kill, kill. And this is my favorite story of amok, from a French author, French explorer, Grand Pré, somewhere between 1790 and 1805. The natives of Malacca, eating a great quantity of opium, produces on them a furious drunkenness, too large a dose, a paroxysm of rage, from which death alone can relieve them. Armed with a poniard, which they call Christ, poniard I think is a knife sort of, which leaves a wound at least 2 inches wide, the more terrible from being poisoned, to form an idea of the rage and fury with which this opium inspires them. See them in their combats on board pirate vessels, receive a lance through their bodies, and not being able to draw it out, take hold of it and plunge it further in, to be able to get at their enemy and stab him with their Christ, a species of ferocity that obliges ships in danger of falling in with them to provide themselves with lances that have a guard through the middle of the shaft, by means of which they keep them off and suffer them to die on their own. Okay. So, the first mention of the amok tale has to do with opium through and through. And it's sort of forgotten. Every generation or two there's a critic that just tears the myth apart, but he's forgotten and things go on. And the Opium War comes along. How many of you know when the Opium War is? Opium War of 1840 and 41 is. Okay. Shortly after that, there's another revival of interest in it. And then it dies. The myth dies. But it gets resurrected because a new tale has entered the literature. The Assassin's Tale, that old story of the 1300s, gets repeated by de Sacy, a French explorer who accompanied Napoleon in Egypt, and he reports that hashish causes murder, causes assassinations. And almost overnight, the myth becomes not that opium causes running amok, but that cannabis causes running amok. It happens instantaneously. And then it gets repeated 2 or 3 times every few years, and with a critic every 20 years. But another interesting thing happens to me, and that is that the myth gets repeated by Americans instead of British and instead of foreigners. It becomes an American myth. The British, mainly in India, have rejected opium causes running amok, and then reject cannabis running amok. And I have, what is that? I have 60 articles from 1800 to 1930. And 40 of them are by Americans, and there's one sentence of criticism of the concept. Among the 16 articles by British writers, 6 of them are critics of the system. So the British have made a decision in the 1900s to do away with this thing, and Americans have gotten very interested in running amok on marijuana. And the concept lies there. It's a stillborn concept. And I'm just looking for 2 American quotes to sort of conclude this. And these are from the late 1920s. One is the Hearst correspondent. This is the way she deals with the muck.
What paper was that from?
This is in the Los Angeles Examiner.
What's the date?
The date is February 25th, 1927, and the author is Winifred Black. Hashish will turn the mildest man into a bloodthirsty murderer. A man who smokes hashish runs amok with his bloody knife in one hand and his strangling cloth in the other, and he kills the hashish until the hashish is burnt out in deadly flames. 2 years later, the Surgeon General of the U.S., Cummings by name, writes the following. I like the modest, it is sometimes alleged that the murderer's frenzy of the melee characterized as running amok is the result of the habitual use of hashish. It is also said that the Mohammedan leaders opposing the Crusades utilized the services of individuals addicted to the use of hashish for secret murders. The frenzy produced by the drug led to these persons being called Hashishin, Hashasins, or Hashishi, from which the modern word assassin. Okay. So what do I conclude out of all this? Well, for one thing, a desire to ban marijuana or ban cannabis comes in other countries besides the U.S., comes before the 1930s, and comes from countries which don't have a hemp industry or don't have laws against the hemp industry or don't worry about a hemp industry. It seems to me that the concept of marijuana prohibition lies so far back and lies so into something basic about getting at strangers. The transition from opium leaves to amok to marijuana leaves to amok was so sudden, without opposition, that all I can say is that there's something religious, something psychological, something basic. People love to make stories about people in order to get at people and destroy them. It's not a very optimistic message to leave on, but I reached that conclusion. So, final pep talk. It's the 69th year of the war on marijuana. And somebody said it started in 1970. The Marijuana Tax Act is 1937. It's the 69th year of the war on marijuana. And in honor of 69, I suggest it's time to turn our usual policies, which is the same old missionary position, upside down. So just say no to the war on marijuana, no to the war on opium, and no to the war on drugs. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to pick up from there, actually, and talk about the origins of the war on marijuana. And actually, it isn't 1937. It goes back before that. It goes back to the turn of the century when the war on drugs was first being devised 100 years ago, as I was talking about earlier. The war on, and it wasn't the war on marijuana. No one hardly had heard of marijuana until really the 1920s in the United States. The war was actually on cannabis indica because that's how the drug was known early on. If you go back to the 19th century, when cannabis was perfectly legal, it was basically known by 2 names in the U.S. market. There was cannabis indica, which was a medicine, which is available in drugstores or pharmacies since 1850 or so in the United States. And then there was this exotic stuff called